I do tend to think that things that have incredibly long time horizons often do involve market failures. So if you think about basic science or coming up with new theories of mathematics, these are not the kinds of things for which they're necessarily a well-defined market to pay people. One of the places where I would disagree with Gates is that it is not at all clear to me that we have a government that is doing this much better. I think markets are often not thinking on a long time horizon. Our government structurally is doing even less so. When you have a government where people are up for election at most once every 6 years, which is for a U.S. senator, that's a time horizon that's much shorter than in a market where a company is looking at 10, 15, 20 years, which is a time horizon over which its stock price is typically valued. We want people to have long-term time horizons, and so I think to some extent there's a cultural question. People should be thinking of life is long. It doesn't end in 6 months or in 3 years, whatever the next line on your resume is. It's something that for most of us we can expect to go on for quite a number of decades ahead. I think somehow people should be encouraged to think about a very long time horizon, and I think this is true for businesses, it's true for governments, and it's true for people doing things in the nonprofit sector. Technology and capitalism are linked. I would frame the link a little bit differently. I think that capitalism works best in a technologically progressing society. In the developed world, technological progress means you can have a situation where there's growth, where there's a way in which everybody can be better off over time. If you have technological progress, that will encourage a more capitalist system. On the other hand, if you don't, if things are stalled, you end up with much more of a zero-sum type thing where there's no progress and basically everybody's gain is somebody else's loss. And that, I think, tends to encourage a much less capitalist system, and that's where you sort of get what I've often called a bull market in politics, where politics becomes more important, people become more interested in using the government to get things for their particular interest group, and the whole thing can sort of spiral downwards instead of and become a vicious cycle where more government regulation leads to less technology, leads to demand for even more politics to redistribute the pie that's no longer growing. Technological progress in the last few decades in computers, the internet, we've seen a lot less in areas like transportation. So, the fastest airplanes was the Concorde in 1970, and they've gotten slower over the last 40 years. Medicine, healthcare has seen some progress, but it's been pretty limited the last 20 years, where the development of new drugs and treatment seems to have been badly stalled. Energy is an area where there's been very limited progress, and the actual cost of oil was $3 a barrel in 1973. Today it's around $85 a barrel. Even inflation adjusted, the real prices have gone up because somehow we've not been making enough progress in developing the technologies for alternative and cheaper types of energy. It's interesting, at least, that a lot of these sectors correlate with places where there's heavy government regulation. Government has not regulated the computer industry or the internet. They thought that Bill Gates working with his computer in his parents' garage was not a really interesting or important thing, not worthy of scrutiny or regulation. It didn't matter. That's been the same perspective people have by and large had with respect to the internet since the mid-90s, and so you've had a lot of progress and innovation there. Healthcare, on the other hand, has been subject to massive regulation. Strangely, had the most progress in some ways, where you have cheaper treatments at better quality in things like cosmetic surgery and things like that, which are less regulated and again deemed to be unimportant by the government. The regulatory load on technology has gotten to be quite high, and there is this very important question of how much progress we're likely to see in the next few decades. From my perspective, the critical thing is actually to figure out a way to get the technology engine restarted. We would like to have less government regulation to enable that, and if it gets restarted, you can have a more capitalist type system. But I do think that if technology is stalled out, we will probably see at some point a resumption of the trend towards more government, even though it's unlikely, in my opinion, to actually fix things. Technology is probably the single biggest driver of productivity gains over a period of several decades for the developed countries. It's, for example, I think much more important than free trade. I'm in favor of free trade, but I think if you had to make a choice between having technological progress versus free trade, and you had one or the other, you should always pick technological progress. I think it's an incredibly important variable for creating more prosperity. The developing world does not really need to develop new technologies. If you're China or India, the next 20 years, the plan is basically to catch up to the U.S., to get 19th century plumbing and 20th century railroads, and basically just to copy. That is not a strategy that works for the developed world if we're going to try to improve living standards in the developed world. So the developing world can just do things that are extensive or horizontal, that basically copy. The developed world needs to do things that are intensive or vertical, where we take our civilization to the next level. And to the extent people don't believe this is going to happen, you see a lot more pessimism about the future. When you have these surveys of people and they ask, will the next generation of Americans be better off than the current one or worse off, more and more people believe that it will be worse off and it's a lot more than, say, would have thought this in the late 1960s, when people believed there was incredible technological progress and people would, we'd be on the moon by 1980 in a permanent lunar base, and by Mars 1990, by 2001 it was Space Odyssey, you'd be at Jupiter, and from there it would be on to the stars, and that's not the kind of future people expect, and I think that's one of the reasons they're so pessimistic. It's not articulated in quite this way, but if people were super optimistic about technology, there would be no reason to be pessimistic about the future. A lot of the political debates we have in the U.S. Today, for example, about deficit spending, the debt, austerity, would not be problems if we had technological progress. If you doubled the debt over the next 20 years in the U.S. and the size of the economy doubled because of technological progress and growth, the two would roughly cancel out and it would all be a totally manageable situation. On the other hand, one of the reasons I think people are increasingly nervous about all this borrowing is because they think that we're not actually digging ourselves out of a hole, but instead are digging ourselves into a deeper and deeper hole, and will not be able to pay it back because we're not actually creating the new technologies that will enable us to pay it back, and the money somehow not really being invested in the future or in progress. It's quite unclear where we are headed. We've certainly had a bit of an experiment of going towards more government over the last few years. The experiment doesn't seem to be working terribly well. On the other hand, it's also quite unclear if we go back towards less government, that's going to work. In the U.S., we fundamentally need to do new things, which I think is harder for the government to do. And moreover, it is not something our government actually is inclined to particularly do. Our government is not dominated by engineers, it is dominated by lawyers. Engineers are interested in substance, in building things. Lawyers are interested in process and rights and getting the ideology correctly blended. And so there is sort of no really concrete plan for the future. It is, I think, a striking failure on the part of the left especially, which is pushing for more and more government, that there's actually nothing specific that the money would be spent on. If you had Obama go on TV and say that we need to have a manned base on the moon, or that we will defeat cancer in 5 years, a la Kennedy or a la Nixon, this would just strike people as bizarre. And so the governing class in the U.S. Is not focused on technology, does not believe it, and so even if you need government to create technology and to build it in the most developed countries, and even if it's the space race where it was heavily government funded is the correct paradigm, the fact of the matter is that our political leadership does not believe in this. Technology innovation is still the best place is still Silicon Valley, and California is still the best place for technology innovation, which is the business that I'm in and am going to be in for the decades ahead. The worry is obviously that this engine gets regulated or constrained and slows down, and in that case, I think you have even worse problems in California and the U.S. But they are problems that probably extend to much of the developed world. The seasteading initiative that we've been talking about for the last few years is a bit of an experimental project. It's run by this guy Patrick Friedman, the grandson of Milton Friedman, the the famous economist. It's this idea about can you create experimental new types of communities on the oceans. I think from a technological perspective, something like seasteading is an important frontier for us to look at. We need to be looking at all the unexplored frontiers that have not been taken. And if you sort of go back to the 1960s, people thought of space as the final frontier, but they also had all these ideas about exploring and developing the oceans, which cover 70% of the Earth's surface and are largely undeveloped. Plans to turn deserts into arable land and reforesting the deserts, and so there are all these sort of frontiers that are that we think are very underdeveloped, and it is worth trying to go back to that spirit of trying to move the frontier of human knowledge and progress.